Hello and welcome to Opwall Field Notes, a podcast created by Operation Wallacea to share stories and insights from our 25 years working in the field. My name is Sophia Wood, Opwall's country manager for Ecuador and director of Friends of Wallacea, and I will be your host for this series. We launched this podcast to shine a light on the world of biodiversity field research and the work of those who dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting our planet. Each month, we have conversations with scientists, community conservationists, and experienced academics about new research, protecting biodiversity, and daily life out in the field. For this special episode, I'll be interviewing Dr. Tim Coles, the founder and CEO of Operation Wallacea. Tim comes from a long career in connecting conservation and business to create sustainable long-term solutions for the industry. Prior to founding Opwall, Tim was a fisheries scientist with over 13 years' experience in the UK water industry and river management. In the 1990s, he founded several organizations for environmental management and auditing that are still active today, with thousands of members around the world. Of course, what Tim is best known for in our circles is as the founder of Opwall, which he started in 1995 with the first expedition to Indonesia. Tim also went on to found the Wallacea Trust in 1998 to support conservation projects stemming from Opwall's yearly research expeditions. Opwall now operates in 13 countries, bringing over 3,000 students into the field every year alongside field researchers and academics, which has resulted in more than 550 scientific publications. Yet in 2020, for the first time in 25 years, Opwall did not open a single field site. The culprit? The COVID-19 pandemic. We recorded this special episode with Tim to discuss how Opwall has been impacted by the ban on international travel, what this means for our industry and international conservation in general, and how Opwall has adapted to these unexpected and challenging circumstances. I hope you enjoy this special episode of Opwall's Field Notes. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Opwall podcast. Since we're taping everything from home today, where are you based right now?
I'm based in Old Bolingbroke, which is a small village in Lincolnshire. It's actually a royal village because King Henry IV was born here in the castle, and it's only got 300 people. It's in the Lincolnshire Wold. It's very pretty and countryside around it. And this is where Opwall is based as an organisation, because we thought it'd be quite amusing to try and set up a big international biodiversity research organisation from a tiny village in the Lincolnshire Wolds.
Yes, well, it is a very unique place for a large international organization like Opwall that's working in 13 different countries. Unexpected, one might say. So obviously, I know there's a lot we could get into in this interview, since obviously in many ways you're the driving force behind a lot of what we do at Opwall. So just to get started, could you tell us maybe a little bit more about why you started the organization?
Well, the main reason was because it was very difficult to get funding for long-term biodiversity research, because you can get grants for about 3 years, or if you're very lucky, 5 years. But then after that, you have to apply again. And if you don't get the grant, and most times you don't, then that's the end of your project. So it meant that it was very difficult to look at long-term changes in ecology, because a 3-year data set is next to useless. You need 5, 10, 15, 20 years worth of data. So how do you fund that? And there were very, very, very few funds available for funding that sort of long-term research. And so the reason we started Operation Wallacea was basically to find a way in which we could fund that research long-term by having students who've got paid tuition fees to then work alongside publishing scientists. So that was really the main reason for forming it. And it's been running for 25 years, since 1995. But sadly, the one thing we didn't anticipate was an international pandemic that would close everything down. So until that point, it was, and will be again, a very successful way of funding long-term biodiversity research.
Yeah, this year's obviously not been anticipated by anyone, but certainly our industry has been particularly hard hit. Well, before we get into some of the details of what Opwall's been doing to deal with this challenge, unprecedented challenge, I'm sure you have a lot of stories from out in the field, but what's one of the coolest or craziest things you've seen while working out in the field with Opwall?
Oh, wow, there are just so many. I mean, one that springs to mind is I remember being on one of the early ship-based teams that was based out in Indonesia, and we came across a very large pod of killer whales in a very remote atoll. It was a fantastic sight. But I mean, there are just so many. It's from, seeing those crazy jumping sifakas in our camp in Madagascar, or, some of the, the wild dogs and some of the other amazing stuff that you see if you go to the African sites. So there are just so many. It's impossible to be able to say, what's the most exciting thing you've ever seen, because there are so many of them.
That's fair. I'm surprised you didn't say something that had to do with a bird.
That's it. Well, I'm trying to keep away from birds for you.
Well, obviously, as you mentioned, this year has been really hard for our industry, which relies heavily on international travel. Opwall's still going strong and working hard to support partners and our team through this time. What are some of the ways Opwall has innovated to adapt to the pandemic and the international lockdowns?
Right, well, there are quite a few, because I think when we come out of this pandemic, which we will, that we cannot rebuild an organisation that is 100% reliant on international travel, because unfortunately, having seen the way the world's reacted, and probably the most successful places have been those that have locked down hardest and quickest, I think next time that there is an international pandemic, and there will be another one, that we're likely to be disrupted. So we're looking not just the short-term pivot to get us through this bit, but also at a long-term pivot. And there are a few things that we're particularly interested in. One of them is trying to get reforestation, natural reforestation that is, going again, but using carbon credits that are coming from the private sector. And one of the interesting things is multinationals are spending billions now every year on buying carbon credits. And yet that money is not actually really driving reforestation rates yet. And the reason for that is partly because of the cost of the reforestation credits as opposed to the cost of renewable type credits. Because, for example, if you build a wind farm and you then generate a gigawatt of electricity, you can then sell that carbon credit, because you can claim that, okay, well, if I didn't generate that gigawatt of electricity, a coal burning power station would have done, and therefore we've saved that many tons of carbon dioxide. Now, that is only true, of course, if the wind farm wouldn't have existed if you hadn't bought those carbon credits. And in the early days of renewables, that was true. But now, virtually every country's got minimum requirements now for renewables as part of their energy portfolios. And those types of organisations have to exist. And so the funding's already in position for wind farms, so they can sell credits very cheaply indeed, $2, $3, $4, $5. Whereas when you get to reforestation, it's up at $15 for natural reforestation. And so we've been looking particularly at areas that have got high levels of carbon that have been sequestered, either in the soil, in the case of peat forest, or in the mangroves, in the case of the sediment below them. And they have up to 3 times more carbon per unit of area compared to normal forests, which means there's a way in which you can then drive the price down to something like $5, $5 to $7 a credit. So you're competing directly then with wind farm type of credits. And we've got a couple of projects in Borneo that we're working on large-scale reforestation. And we're doing these not just so that we can reforest those areas, but so that we can demonstrate that we can drive the prices down to a level where multinationals will see reforestation as the natural way to go instead of buying these wind farm credits. And that's important because there's a set of principles that come out called the Oxford Principles, which have been widely quoted now. What they're arguing is that what you should be doing if you're spending money on climate change, you should concentrate on things that are sequestering carbon, not just reducing the amount of carbon you're emitting. And the best way of sequestering carbon, as we know, is replacing natural forests. We know if we replace large areas of natural forest, that we can drive the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere down enormously. And the interesting thing is, working on the basis that we're working on with Borneo, for just over $1 billion, you could actually reforest all of the mangroves that have been lost since 2002 in the world, assuming you can get it down to the sort of prices that we're talking about.
Wow.
And that would make a huge difference. And so that's one of the major projects we're working on at the moment. Another one is on greening in the UK, because one of the strange thing, one of the good things in a sense about the pandemic is it's made everyone stop and think, what's happening in the world, and we are losing biodiversity at a terrific rate. We really are. So whilst climate change is a major issue, I think alongside that, it's biodiversity loss. Reforestation, as we've just been talking about, that's the answer to both climate change and loss of species. But bringing it to the UK, which is where we're based, we're one of the worst countries in the world for damaging biodiversity. We're the 29th worst performer in the world, which is not a great league table to be near the top of. And it's simply because, largely due to things like the Common Agricultural Policy that have been paying farmers to basically intensively produce food on land and to rip out hedges and not to worry about wildlife and so forth. And the things we've lost here are really quite incredible. If you go to our Romania site and see what England would have looked like about 300, 400 years ago, with the hedgerows and the scrubby areas, and there you've got redback shrikes and wrynecks and lesser spotted woodpeckers and all the sorts of things that we used to have here. But we've lost so many insects in Britain and in Europe, in fact. And that's what's driven down a lot of the population crashes. Things like the cuckoos are beginning to disappear from Britain. So, spotted flycatchers, in Lincolnshire, in our area, I didn't actually see one last summer, which is most unusual because you generally see them around. And so we're working there because the government has set up a lot of funds now to re-green Britain. We see that as a fantastic opportunity to start working with farmers in our local area here. And we're forming what's called a facilitation group, where we get a group of farmers together, up to 2,000 hectares or more. And then we advise them on how they can use these grant systems to maximise the wildlife on their land. And we can do that for them free of charge, because the benefit to us is one of the opportunities that the government is allowing is a thing called educational visits. And they'll actually pay for people schools to come in groups of 6 for 2 hours to learn about wildlife conservation and food production side by side. So just by having those numbers of people coming, you can actually pay for all the work that's necessary for us to help those farmers to get that sort of agricultural uplift. And then the third element we're doing is a lot of stuff on training. We've got a linkage with NEP estate in Sussex, which is Britain's premier rewilding site. Fantastic place. It was a farm that was in 3,500 acres. It's intensively managed for farming for many generations. And all that was happening was they're spending more money every year, putting more fertilizer and herbicide and pesticides into it, and getting lower and lower yields in the end. So in the end, in about the year 2000, they said, well, that's enough. We're going to stop. We are not going to carry on farming. We're going to let it go. But you can't just let the stuff go. What they were trying to do was to then mimic what would have happened, what it would have been like 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago in Britain, we had auroch, which is sadly now extinct. So you have to use things like longhorn cattle to replace them. We had tarpan, which is not quite extinct. There is some work on a near tarpan in parts of Europe, but they've been replaced by Exmoor ponies. They've added in 3 species of deer, 2 of which were naturally here, and they've added in Tamworth pigs, because wild boar are kind of dangerous when you're working. Now, they've been added in at very low levels, but the idea is that the big herbivores would have been what would have sculpted the landscape. So the idea that Britain was covered in forest from the top to the bottom is nonsense. About a third of it would have been forest, about a third of it would have been scrub, and about a third would be open grassland. And what they're trying to do with introducing those large herbivores is to replicate that. And they've now added beaver as well, because if you want to upset rivers and increase your biodiversity in wetland areas, stick a few beavers in. Fantastic for doing that. And so the end result of this is, after 20 years, they've had the biggest uplift in biodiversity of any site in Britain. And you're talking about comparing it with national parks, you're comparing it with wildlife managed reserves. It's just been fantastic. They've gone from virtually nothing to loads of pairs of turtle doves. They've got nightingales everywhere. They've got the highest density of lesser whitethroats and blackcaps anywhere. They've got 12 of the bat species. They've got all the breeding owl species. They even had white storks breeding there this year again. So it's an incredible success story. And it's been done basically by private investment. But one of the things we're keen on doing is bringing that idea to other farmers, because there is a lot of government money for them to be able to rewild areas, but there's also a lot of money in multinationals who are setting net carbon zero targets, but they're also setting net nature benefit targets. Well, if you want to have the biggest bang for your buck, invest in a rewilding project, because that would really change the amount of species you're going to have in a particular area. So those are the types of things. We're running training courses there and training students in how to do some of the skills they're going to need to get into this sort of rewilding or regreening of Britain. So things like a thing called the UK HAB map. You've got to learn how to do the DEFRA biodiversity metric. We can teach them about rewilding. So we're running courses down there. We're running online training courses as well for students. So those are the sorts of things that we see ourselves going into long term. A mix of rewilding, training, carbon, but always keeping that long-term biodiversity data sets going in as many countries as we can.
Wow, it sounds like there's a lot on your and our plate right now. So in terms of the rewilding, and especially in kind of what you've been talking about in greening the UK, is Opwall investing in working with farmers to help them go towards a NEP estate model?
Yes, but I mean, you can't generally with farmers go straight away into the NEP estate model. And besides, you need a fairly large area to do it in, because what you're doing by rewilding is you're releasing the large herbivores at a very low density, about 0.2 livestock units per hectare, whereas you'd normally have at least 1 or 2 livestock units per hectare if you're doing it commercially. And so you need quite a large area to do that. So what we're doing is, in the UK, we have a scheme called a facilitation scheme, which pays us, the government pays us to get groups of farmers together, to start working together on having grants to put in things like pollination mixes of plants to help the insects, putting in winter bird food, cereal that feeds winter birds and increases the flocks of winter birds there. A whole series of different things. And that's what we're doing at the moment. We're forming that facilitation group. We're helping them to get grants in order to, they will then get funded to do the sort of work that they want to do. But in the long run, once we've got everyone working together, the concept is to bring in some private sector funding and say, look, we've got 2,000 hectares here. The farmers would like to rewild it, and they can get some money from the government for doing this, but we need some extra money to really push it and make it happen on the larger scale. So that's the sort of project that we're looking to be involved in.
Got it. Very exciting. And are you seeing opportunities to follow the NEP estate model in some of the other countries where we work, or opportunities in conservation in this new field of rewilding?
Yes, I mean, rewilding is happening in a whole series of different countries. I mean, in particular in Holland, in the Netherlands, they're probably the world leaders in it. They have a very big site there. Looking at places like Transylvania, you don't really need to rewild. It is already rewilded to a large extent.
Right.
So I would see this sort of project working more in the intensively farmed areas of Europe, and in particular in areas where food production is marginal. So when you come up here on the Lincolnshire Wolds, it's sort of chalk areas, gently rolling hills. The return you're getting on your farm is very, very low indeed. And so those are the areas that need to come out of production and into wildlife protection. But the idea is not, you can't rewild, highly productive areas. They've got to be highly productive in order to keep feeding the population. But take out the low production areas. Those are the ones that we're aiming at.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, you mentioned the work at NEP and training courses as an opportunity for people in the UK to learn about some of the skills that you would need in rewilding and conservation without having to leave the country. Has Opwall been developing any other kinds of in-country programs for students to be able to learn about biodiversity now that it's becoming increasingly difficult to leave home countries?
Yes, I mean, a couple of courses are running down there. Is one where half their time is spent learning different survey techniques, and half the time we give them a big data set and we teach them how to use R and the open source software that's used by most universities to analyze those data sets. And we bring in people who work professionally in conservation management or in climate change to talk to the students about the sort of careers there are. That's one. Another one is aimed more at graduates that are coming out of the British UK system, and sadly quite often they come out with no actual skills to be able to go into this sort of field. I mean, if you turn up at a consultant and want to get a job, if you can't do a UK habitat map, you're not going to get a job. So we're training people in how to do things like a UK habitat map, how to we have a new law coming in England, which is saying that every new planning application that goes through has to have a 10% biodiversity uplift. So it has to be 10% more biodiversity at the end of the project than at the beginning. And how do you assess that? So students have got to be trained in how the government are expecting you to assess the biodiversity value before the development and after the development, and how you can then get biodiversity uplift by offsetting in other sites. Those skills, if you talk to your average graduate student and they've come out, they don't have those skills because they're not taught. And what we're trying to do is to give some students practical experience on the ground, but using NEP as the example. I mean, what a fantastic place to learn how to do a UK habitat map, do it in NEP rather than a big agricultural field. And then, of course, there's all the online stuff. We're doing a lot of online courses. We're doing the science-based ones, which are how you take a data set and use R. We're doing the marketing and business development type projects using examples of businesses like a dive center in Croatia, and how would you build that up, or a cloud forest research center, how could you turn that into a commercial operation? And we're hoping also to have one for medical students, where we have a lot of doctors, nurses, emergency staff that have come out into the field. So the idea is to have a different one every day, talking to them about what sort of career they've had, and giving them some practical problems to solve. And so that one should also be coming on stream shortly.
Fantastic. So these are opportunities for people who want to keep learning about biodiversity and research and ecology with Opwall from home until travel restarts again.
Absolutely. And I think we'll keep them going because they've been very, very popular indeed. I mean, over 600 students have already done some of those online courses with us.
Wow.
So they're proven to be very popular. There's a demand for it, and particularly in lockdown, of course, because people can't go and get work experience in industries, but they can now do it online, and at the same time, they can learn a skill with us.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, I think almost every industry has gone online to some extent this year, but ours is one of the most challenging to shift online. So I was wondering if you could go into maybe some of the biggest lessons that we've learned and you've learned about conservation, and even about working across borders from this pandemic, and maybe how these lessons are impacting how Opwall thinks about the future.
Well, there's only so much you can do online. So if you want conservation to work in practice, you have to get on the ground, and you have to have agreements with local communities, and there has to be a financial benefit to those local communities. So one of the big problems of the pandemic has been, whilst we're all upset about losing income or not being able to go out, the impact on Western nations has been tiny in comparison to the impact on the sort of places we're working. So if you go to places like Indonesia, to the remote villages we work in, not having Opwall go there for the first time in 25 years, not having the income from them, is a huge blow. And that's not being offset by government expenditure. And the same is true at every one of those partners. Now, the difficulty is we don't have money coming in from students, but we have still, in my view, got to provide some support for them. And the way we've been doing it, and I think you'll hear more about this in a separate podcast, is we've been doing some reforestation work in Indonesia, because there's plenty to go out in Indonesia in terms of needs to reforest. And we established 3 different tree nurseries. They now have 30,000 trees in them, and we're just on the process of getting them planted out. Now, if people or schools or industries are interested in offsetting, or students even offsetting some of their carbon, then what they can do is invest in this project to replant some of the areas that have been badly damaged. And Alex Toes, I think, will be talking about that a little bit more in the future. But that was a way we've been able to fund them to build those tree nurseries. Hopefully, with the carbon funding coming in, we can actually get some planting going on as well in Sulawesi. And we've got other projects running with partners. So in Transylvania, for example, we've got an EU grant to help develop a wildlife research centre and work with some of the communities. In Guyana, we have a similar type of project where there's a little bit of money to be able to start working with communities to see if they can get visitors outside the Opwall season attracted there to go and see the amazing wildlife you have in Guyana. And in Mexico, well, Mexico's a strange one because sadly there's a big train system going slap bang through a biosphere reserve. And so our teams there, what they are doing, have been contracted to look at ways in which that can be done to minimise the impact on the biodiversity. And it's also linked with training wildlife guides, not just in Mexico, but over the border in Guatemala and also in Belize, all part of the same big forest system. And that's ways in which we can get money spent in those communities so they get a little bit of income. But we need to get back in the field, and we need students and others who work with us to come back as soon as we can travel, get out there, because that's putting large amounts of money into those communities.
Right. Well, you answered one of my other questions. I was going to ask you how Opwall's been supporting our in-country partners through this crisis. And obviously, you know, working with the other country managers, we've seen almost everyone stand up and fundraise for communities or look for alternative sources of income, like you've done in Sulawesi, or we've done in Transylvania and Guyana. So as much as obviously our regular work has been stopped, you know, I guess Opwall hasn't stopped caring about our in-country partners. So I'm glad you brought that up.
You did forget to mention your own work there in Ecuador, with the fundraising for Ecuador and the other schemes that you've developed there. And of course, Joe in Fiji's raised some money for, was a major typhoon went through there. Exactly the same things happened sadly in Honduras, and we've had another team raising money to do that. So lots of different projects have been happening by staff to help those local communities.
Right. Yes. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that we've seen is the Opwall team coming together through this time to help each of the communities that we care so much about. And as you said, you know, have been even more heavily impacted by the economic crash related to COVID than any of us in the US or the UK have. What do you think is the best way for individuals to support conservation and organizations like ours and like our partners during this kind of crisis?
Well, during the crisis, it's very difficult. Supporting some of the fundraising efforts that the teams have done to get money directly to those communities always works well. I mean, I have to say, whenever we have a major tragedy around the world, which sadly we do have, and we've had to raise money for them, I've always found that the Opwall teams are fantastically efficient at being able to get the money to the right people. I do remember when we had the tsunami incident in Indonesia many years ago. Our doctors and they were Indonesian doctors and Indonesian staff decided to put a team together. They flew to Sumatra and they rented a warehouse and they lived in the warehouse. Now, all the other international teams coming from Red Cross and so forth were staying in smart hotels. Our team stayed on the ground in the large warehouse, and they took medical supplies and they treated a whole series of people. Wow. And I was so impressed with that because for every pound spent, it was getting directly through to those communities. And I always think if you're looking for effective organisations on the ground, they're quite often small ones because they're not spending a lot of money on administration or having highly paid staff. They are people like our teams that are committed to those local communities and often doing it on a voluntary basis. So if I was trying to spend money to help communities around the world, I'd look for that type of organisation. Once we come out of the pandemic, come back with us, come and see some of these places if you haven't already seen them, because you're not just helping map the wildlife, you're helping those communities to protect their own forests and their own reefs. Because quite often they want to do that, but they need an income from somewhere. And if they can see an income coming in by going to stay in these remote communities, then they'll want to save those areas. And we've seen that time and time again.
I think those are two great pieces of advice. Obviously, almost all of our partners are very small NGOs or local communities that are voluntarily working to protect the areas where they work. And part of Opwall's work and some of the stuff that we've done developing tourism is so that they can continue to do that, just so they have the money to do that. Well, I'm nearly through all my questions. I wanted to ask you before we kind of round out, if you have any tips or advice for young people looking to go into the field of conservation. Obviously, you've worked with thousands of high school and university students at all of our sites. And I wonder if there's any lessons you've learned or tips and advice you might want to share with people looking to get into this field, even in this difficult time.
Well, I think it's a good field to get into at this difficult time. I mean, just take the example of Britain. At the moment, farmers get a thing called a basic payment system. They get paid for the amount of land they have. And they can, if they have a special scheme, they can get some top-up money from things called higher tier stewardship. There's 20,000 of them have got that. By 2023, when that system closes and the basic payment system is halved, 200,000 farmers have to now have their land managed for environmental reasons as well as for crop production. 200,000. We haven't a very, very small number of people that are coming out of university that actually got the practical skills to do that. Look at things like the multinationals that are setting targets like net carbon zero. Pretty well every multinational is doing that now, either for 2050 or 2030, or sometimes, if they're really advanced, carbon negative they're setting targets for. And that's a huge amount of expenditure. So Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England, and he's now the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Change, he's called on the markets to produce basically a marketplace of $100 billion a year to help with climate change. $100 billion. Now, if you're a student, I would always look to see where the money is going, where the money is being spent. And if you've got $100 billion knocking about, there's going to be some decent jobs. Go back to England, go back to the biodiversity uplift. That's every single planning application in Britain. Everything from, a train line to a power station, everything has to have a biodiversity uplift. Where are the practical skills for that? So whenever we're talking to students about it, firstly, it's a fantastic career to go into. Secondly, if you're going to want to get into it, try and get some practical skills. So yes, go and do your biology degree or your geography or environmental science. But while you're doing it, try and join a local wildlife club. Get some actual practical experience on how you identify birds, or you can work with bats or badgers or whatever. Secondly, once you've got your degree, try and get some practical experience working with organisations on the ground, volunteering somewhere. I mean, we'd love to have you in the field. If you come out with us in the field, you get exposed to a whole series of different scientists and different survey techniques. But if you can't come out with us in the field, then go and volunteer at an organisation. But don't volunteer just for things like tree planting or hedge laying. Those are general skills that a lot of people have. Try and get on to the surveys, the ones where you're actually going to learn at the same time as adding something to it. And also, try and learn a language, because again, a lot of the really good jobs are if you're bilingual. It's so important because it opens up so many other opportunities in the world besides the countries in which you're living. So yeah, I'd strongly recommend to students now. It's a great potential for the future. Things are going to change when this pandemic finishes. There's going to be a lot more money spent on climate change, spent on biodiversity protection, and we don't have the people with the skills. So try and get some of those skills and come and join us.
I think that's great advice. And obviously, speaking more than one language is huge, because a lot of the most under-researched areas where we end up working are places that are non-English speaking. And of all the countries we work in, I think about 2 speak English, South Africa and Guyana. So, and Fiji. So, being able to work in a different language is really big. But I also think what uplifting news to hear that conservation might be an actual profitable field in the near future. You know, you make us sound like programmers now. There's going to be a lack of talent and an abundance of funding. So I hope that does come to fruition in the near future. Well, to end us out on a positive note, I wanted to ask you why you personally believe we should keep fighting to protect biodiversity and prevent climate change, and really what gets you out of bed in the morning.
It's precisely that, fighting biodiversity and climate change, because climate change is happening, no doubts about it. Biodiversity loss, which is far less publicised, but in my view, even more serious, is also happening. We're heading for the sixth extinction. We've got a massive rate of loss. And things like the drop-off in insect abundance in places like Europe are really scary. Huge drops off. And that affects so many other things down the sort of ecological chain. So trying to do something about that, trying to get other people involved who are not necessarily experienced in it, but want to learn about it with scientists. I think that's a fantastic thing to be able to do, because if we can motivate a whole series of people to get involved in biodiversity protection and climate change, then we're making a big difference in the world. And that's what I'm most proud of. We have a fantastically strong team working at Opwall. We've got fantastically strong partners, and all over the world, students who've worked with us and then gone on to conservation careers. So there's a real network of people out there now who've come through Opwall, as it were, and gone on to help change the world. And as I say, I think the speed of change in terms of making a difference for climate change and protecting biodiversity is going to be quite considerable after this pandemic finishes.
That's very exciting and inspirational, and always, very pleased to see how many people come through an Opwall season and their careers are changed and ideas are changed about what they're going to do next. As we round out, what are you most looking forward to for the next field season?
Well, I'm just getting there. It would be nice, just actually being in the field again. It was very strange to spend a year in England. I'd spent 25 years always going in the field, somewhere pretty remote, living in a tent in strange places all around the world. And then I'd for a long while said I really would like to see an English summer at some point, because I haven't seen them for 25 years. Well, we got to see one, but sadly they did a lot of damage everywhere else. So I've enjoyed my English summer, but now I think it's necessary to get back out again into the field. And I'm hopeful that at some of the sites this coming summer we'll be running and we'll have students back out in the field.
I hope the same. And I did think it was quite ironic after you and I were in Transylvania right before everything shut down, obviously setting up this wildlife center and talking about how we had not been home for a summer in years. Obviously you for the entirety of my lifetime, and me for a period of time that I have worked at Opwall. But both of us obviously spent a first summer at home in a long time because of this year. So it was a bit ironic. I'm glad we were still able to get out into the field early last February, now a year ago. And I'm looking forward to this year. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tim. And we look forward to hopefully good news soon.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for tuning in to Opwall's Field Notes. It's been a difficult year, but we hope that this interview with Tim has brought you optimism and hope for the future of international conservation. Stay tuned for more episodes about conservation and other biodiversity hotspots around the world, coming soon on Opwall's Field Notes.